doesn't. For nearly 8 decades, Betty White was one of the most beloved women in entertainment history. To millions of people, she was funny, charming, warm, and completely harmless. Doesn't. She looked like the perfect grandmother, the sweet old lady from television who made audiences laugh for generations. Doesn't. But the deeper you look into Betty White's life and career, the more surprising her story becomes. Doesn't. Because behind the smile was a woman who survived some of the darkest and most ruthless eras of Hollywood. A woman who broke industry rules long before it was acceptable, and someone who quietly became one of the most powerful women in television history. And despite the wholesome image the public knew, Betty White was far more fearless than people realized. Betty Marion White was born on January 17, 1922, in Oak Park, Illinois. She was an only child born to Christine Tess and Horace Logan White. Her father worked as a lighting company executive, and her family eventually relocated to California during the Great Depression. Money was tight. Like many American families during that era, the Whites struggled financially. Betty's father reportedly built radios and traded them for goods just to help the family survive. But even during difficult times, Betty's childhood had one thing that remained constant: animals. Her parents loved nature, and Betty developed a deep affection for animals from a very young age. Family trips into the mountains of California helped shape her personality early on. Long before Hollywood ever entered the picture, Betty dreamed of becoming a forest ranger. But there was one problem. At the time, women were not allowed to work in that role. So instead, Betty turned toward writing and performing, and very quickly, she discovered she loved being in front of an audience. While attending school in Beverly Hills, Betty began writing plays and performing in productions herself. She admired entertainers like Jeanette MacDonald and Nelson Eddy, and slowly became fascinated by acting. But this was still the early days of entertainment. Television barely existed. Most people in America still gathered around radios at night. The idea of television becoming the dominant form of media sounded almost unbelievable. Yet somehow Betty White entered the industry at exactly the right moment. Shortly after graduating high school in 1939, she appeared on an experimental television broadcast singing songs from The Merry Widow. At the time, television was still considered a novelty. Nobody could have imagined that Betty White would eventually become one of the defining faces of the medium itself. But before her career could truly begin, the world changed overnight. World War II erupted. Like millions of Americans during the war, Betty temporarily paused her ambitions and volunteered for service through the American Women's Voluntary Services. She drove trucks carrying military supplies throughout Los Angeles and helped entertain soldiers preparing to ship overseas. Years later, she described the period as strange and emotionally exhausting. When the war finally ended, Betty returned to Hollywood, determined to become an actress. But the industry immediately rejected her. Studio executives told her she was not photogenic enough for movies. Again and again, doors closed in her face. Instead of giving up, Betty adapted. She moved into radio. There, appearance mattered less. At first, the jobs were tiny. She read commercials, made background noises, sang for free, and accepted almost any role available. Sometimes she earned only a few dollars per show. But Betty White understood something important very early in her career. Consistency matters more than instant success, doesn't? He discovered she loved being in front of an audience, doesn't? Little by little, her voice became recognizable across radio programs throughout America, and eventually she earned something even bigger, her own show, doesn't? By the late 1940s, Betty White had become part of live television history. She co-hosted a daily variety program called Hollywood on television alongside Al Jarvis, doesn't? The show aired live for hours every single day, and when Jarvis left, Betty took over alone, doesn't? At a time when women rarely controlled television programs, Betty White suddenly became the center of one of the most demanding live productions in America, doesn't? She performed comedy sketches, interviews, singing, improvisation, and audience interaction for over 5 hours a day, 6 days a week, doesn't? Almost nobody in television history has ever worked under those conditions. But Betty thrived in chaos. And then came the moment that changed everything, doesn't? In the early 1950s, Betty White launched The Betty White Show, doesn't? The program made history for several reasons. First, Betty had unusual creative control behind the scenes, doesn't? Second, she became one of the first women in television to work as both performer and producer, doesn't? But most importantly, she refused to bow to racism during one of the most segregated periods in American broadcasting, doesn't? Betty hired African-American tap dancer Arthur Duncan as a regular cast member on the show, doesn't? Southern television stations immediately exploded with outrage. Executives demanded Duncan be removed. Sponsors threatened backlash. Networks feared boycotts, and Betty White was given a choice, doesn't? Protect her career or stand by Duncan. She chose Duncan.